The Embassy of the Dead, Chapter 5, Mum and Dad. Jake gazed out the window of Mum's car as the village passed by. It was reassuring that it was all so familiar, despite what had just taken place in the alleyway. The houses looked the same, the King's Head pub looked the same, the shop looked the same. It was cold and wet. People were still going about their everyday, boring lives. No one knew. Mum glanced at him. "You've got everything packed, right? Toothbrush? Shower gel?" "There's a severed human finger in my bag." "And you'll phone me every evening?" "There's a severed human finger in my bag." "Don't forget to set your alarm. Remember, your dad starts work early tomorrow, so he won't be there to wake you." "There's a severed human finger in my bag." "You'll need to catch your normal bus to school. I'm sorry I couldn't rearrange my shift." "Oh, that's okay." Jake remembered being quite relieved when she told him. He didn't really want his mum dropping him off and trying to kiss him goodbye in front of the whole class. "You've got the number in your phone in case of any problems, okay?" "Jake, have you set your alarm?" Jake looked at his phone. "Yes, Mum." He hadn't. "You must be hungry, love. I'm sure your dad's making something nice for tea. Try to eat some vegetables. You're growing. It's important." Jake nodded. It was weird how having a severed human finger in his bag hadn't put him off dinner. She looked across at him again. Then she patted his leg. "Something's up, isn't it?" Jake's mum was a nurse. She'd probably seen loads of severed fingers. Although she'd never specifically mentioned any, maybe Jake should tell her about the one in his bag. "Give him a chance, Jake." She was talking about Dad again. She did that sometimes, like she thought everything Jake did was connected to the fact that she and Dad had split up. It had taken a while for Jake to understand what Dad moving out meant. He could still remember the conversation they'd had that day. "So how long are you going for?" Jake had asked Dad, but Mum had done all the talking. Dad had spent the entire conversation looking at the ground while Mum skipped around the question. "You can visit him whenever you want. He's only going to be living at the farm." The straight answer would have been forever. The farmer Dad worked for was letting him stay in one of his unfinished holiday bungalows until he found somewhere better. Jake had sighed. "Is it because of the camper van?" Mum shook her head. "No, although that thing is pretty annoying." Jake looked out of the car window and smiled ruefully. He could remember the day Dad had brought the camper van as a family Christmas present 2 years ago. Mum had not been impressed. Now, whenever Mum and Dad argued, which quite frankly was pretty often, Mum brought up the fact that Dad had let Jake drive the camper van on the road. Jake had started learning to drive ages ago on the farm tracks, sitting on Dad's lap until his feet could reach the pedals. The week before Dad had left, Jake had been allowed to drive home from the farm with Dad in the passenger seat. It was only 10 minutes or so along really quiet roads. He could see his dad's face, beaming proudly as they pulled into the driveway. "You're a natural, son." Mum had gone absolutely mad. But she wasn't mad when they had told Jake about them splitting up. She just looked sad. Jake wasn't sure which was worse. "It's just that sometimes people get on better when they live apart, and we don't want to argue anymore," she said. That, at least, was something Jake could agree with. There wasn't much stuff Mum and Dad hadn't argued about. They argued about work, about money, about holidays. Sometimes they even argued about taking him to school. "Is it because of me?" Jake had asked. Mum had shaken her head and hugged him, holding him until he had to push her away. Dad was still looking at the floor, and Jake could remember the feeling of wanting him to say something, wanting him to say anything, even to argue. Anything to change what was happening. But he didn't. He just sat there. That night Jake hadn't been able to sleep. He'd left his bedroom to get a glass of water from the kitchen. When he got to the hallway, he could hear a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It was Dad crying. Jake stopped. Then, unnoticed, he crept back up to bed. The next day, Dad had loaded up the camper van with his stuff. He hardly had anything. Jake and Mum stood on the pavement as Dad climbed into the driving seat and closed the door. He wound down the window. "You coming along?" he'd asked Jake. "We can take the van out." He looked at Mum. "Only on the tracks, mind." Mum smiled and draped her arm around Jake's shoulder. "You go if you want, love." She winked at him. "He'll need some help sorting out his TV." Jake took a deep breath. He couldn't believe it. Dad was leaving and they were talking about the TV, normal stuff, like nothing was happening, like his family wasn't splitting up. It occurred to him that they hadn't even asked him what he thought, like he didn't have a say in whether his family stayed together or not. Why not? They were his parents as much as he was their son. That's how families worked. They stayed together. Jake shook his head. It's all right, Dad. I've got some homework to do. He turned and went inside the house and up to his room, where he buried his head in his pillow and cried until he had no more tears left. So what do you think of that chapter? That's quite different to what we've had so far.
Yeah, it was kind of based on, at first, like, it kind of led from Mum finding something up, and it was a good transition to telling us the backstory of what happened on that day when Dad left. And I suppose it's a good place to put it, because I mean, like, she's saying something and she's giving us information, and we need to know other information. Which one? Well, we don't need to, but it'll make us decode it better.
So it's like background on the characters?
Yeah.
And is this normally where you'd expect that to happen?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Or earlier.
Or earlier. But it might be a bit boring if they started the book off with, this is Jake Green. Jake has a mum and dad. Jake's mum and dad aren't living together anymore. So it started with something that was quite mysterious and exciting, didn't it?
Yeah.
Why do you think it did that?
Well, to make you turn the pages, and also because if it just introduced you then to the characters, then you would be like, okay, story, I'll learn the characters through the book, and then lots of people are just going to skip that part, so the author's trying to make every single part of his book interesting.
Yeah, that's right. What do you think about Jake's relationship with his mum and dad?
Well, I think he doesn't tell them stuff, but that...
Yeah, he hasn't told his mum about the finger, has he?
Yeah, but I wouldn't tell you about if I had a severed finger in my bag.
Well, what do you think his mum would do?
Well, I think his mum would... I don't know, but she wouldn't be happy. She would, like, investigate it, and kids like going on adventures. I say that from my own experience, and also most kids in books do.
Yeah, but what kind of adventure can you have with a severed human finger?
Well, a severed human finger and ghosts.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, he doesn't know if he's going to see the ghost again. Do you know, I think...
but he probably will. I mean, he sensed that there was something next to him.
Do you know, I think that he was nearly going to tell his mum, because remember he said she's a nurse, she must have seen loads of severed fingers. And he says, then it says maybe Jake should tell her about the one in his bag. But then she starts talking about his dad. So he doesn't kind of get the chance to say what's bothering him. She just assumes it's his dad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.